This is the Weigh-In podcast by Ben Watt Chestnut and normally Sebastian Romero, but we will return to our regularly scheduled program at some point. But on this week's Weigh-In, we bring to you big episode 50. This is, 50 episodes of the Weigh-In that have now been put out. This will be episode 50. And, that is a monumental stone for the Weigh-In to pass, 50 episodes, which, it's just been absolutely amazing to get up to 50 episodes and to be able to do so in such a way that we have. So today's episode, we're going to bring to you, this week's basically UFC event. May 31st, we have UFC Fight Night, Blanchfield versus Barber. And we're going to talk all about that and the rest of the month. And as you always know, the boxing that we do, let's get it done. So, without further ado, one more shout out to episode 50. Episode 50, guys. So we're on episode 50. So when we get to, break down, a lot of the stuff, and we'll talk about some of our most kept great stuff, just really when you look at this Barber Blanchfield card, I'm gonna be honest, odds have Blanchfield at negative 250. I believe it. I believe, I believe she's got it. When we talk about Blanchfield, I believe she's got it. Very great MMA fighter. I've seen a lot of those matches, and I know she looked real good. And you gotta the rest of the card is mediocre. I'm more for the main event, more for that main event. On that, um, later we got some stuff that has already gone through. Like Fight Night, 315 Muhammad versus Delamondia, I think is the name. So that was pretty good. St. Dennis won that fight. So yeah, I did end up seeing that event. Real good with Dennis. That was I felt like that was, I'm not gonna say that was a mediocre card, but that was a really good, that 315 was solid. A lot of unanimous decision. Uh on that main card, but honestly thought that was pretty good. There was Burns and Morales fight night. I like that very well because Morales, I felt, did really well with the TKO. Um, you know, there were some good stuff on that card. I mean, on that fight night, and now the next best kept thing. What's going on? I mean, boxing world wise, we know a lot of that. So I mean, with a lot of this being said, um, we're just gonna hib around some of the world's top stuff right now. Um, and then we'll get you. Josh Taylor just lost, so that's huge, huge going on. And we have Canelo Crawford. It's coming. It's coming. So a few things going on. Ricky Hatton talked about Pacquiao, Barrios. So a lot of Pacquiao stuff going around left and right. A lot of stuff people going on about Manny Pacquiao. Um So that's one thing that's going to be really nice. Is a lot of that Manny Pacquiao, that Manny Pacquiao is going to get off and fight again. So if we really, we did our what I'll call, around the sports kind of thing. Now we're gonna get back into this fight night, this Blanchfield Barber. I know I talked little about it, but let's break it down. So when you look at the co-main, you've got a 175 plus 145. You got Kellen plus 145. You got Garmin Rot 175, negative 175. So when you kind of look at this, you kind of look at, I've learned in UFC is not always, it doesn't always go the way you think. We learned this with Bo Nickal's last loss. You could be a top dog. They can all get beat. You know, they can be. That doesn't mean they will do. So one of the things I look at here in this card is they tried to line this up, but they tried to, it almost looks like you built this card so that your best and biggest fight is Blanchfield, which it should always be that way. But you didn't line it up like we thought we would. We got, this is a woman's card, and I'll tell you how many women's fights are on here. 1, 2, 3. Come on, Dana. What are we doing here? 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 And then the men fights we got, like, okay, how many of those guys are stuck for records? Okay, we got a 24-3, a 22-4, we got a 9-3. That was, and one of the welterweight fights, we got an 11-2 record. That's pretty impressive. Okay, we got a 14-1. All right. We got a 9-1. But you got to stack these cards up. You got a woman main event, and there's more. Like, I get it. You're trying to, get your views, but you got to do better than this. You got to do better than this. Like, this is what the UFC fight nights look like? You don't really stack it up like you should. Like, and I say this has been happening because they did a lot of stacking up within the last, April was a good stacking up. Don't even get it twisted. April was stacked up. So I'm not 100% upset because I know April was stacked up, but I kind of feel like you got to stack up. You got to stack up May too. You got to stack up May too. You can't just not let that stack up. So I kind of feel like some stuff. Yeah, so here's what happened. We talk about that round 2 stoppage for D Ryder against Bo Nickel. You hate to see it. You hate to see it. I was rooting for Bo Nickel, as we all, here have. Bo Nickel was a great wrestler, great MMA guy, getting in there and getting his stuff done. Real fiery guy. When you look at a lot of like his press conferences and the way he talks, he believes he can do certain stuff, and that's great. He should be able to do the certain stuff. And I think it's really something where you say, all right, Bo Nickel is a good guy. He he's gonna have a belt, but he got TKO'd. There's no difference than the way they say it. It was once explained to me, you got to go about some of the things the same way. You can't treat any opponent any differently. Now, I'm not saying Bo did or didn't. I'm just saying, we're speaking of the mind here. You got to go about everything the same. You can't, one of the greatest things that was explained to me by, he wasn't directly one of my coaches. He was just, somebody in the area, one of the many clubs I went to over at Bro House, while they were holding something else. He came in and he said to me something that really stuck. He said, you have to believe that every opponent you get across can beat you. Because if you believe everybody can beat you, you'll believe enough that you can stop what's coming. And when he first told it to me, I didn't really take it any which way. I kind of said, what? I didn't understand it. Couple years later, I get to, my senior year, and I finally figured out what it meant. He's not saying, everybody's going to beat you, but he's saying, don't go into a match thinking, or an event, fight, whatever, that you're untouchable. You're not untouchable. And that's what he meant. You're not untouchable. And I didn't understand that at first. And when I finally did, it really helped me, because to go in there and say, okay, I believe you can score against me. I believe you can take me down and turn me a couple of times. Will I allow that to happen? No. I won't allow that to happen. Because why? Because now I take that belief of saying you can beat me, and I train that so you don't beat me. So I get ready for you. I prepare so you don't come at me and stop me. It's kind of, some would say, one of the worst ways to think. But it was explained to me that that's one of the ways to go. That was one of the, I guess, his quotes he gave me was, you have to understand that don't go in there and think just because this person, in terms of just bringing it up, don't say just because this person just started boxing or just started UFC, they're not going to beat me. Or, in jiu-jitsu, they're only a white belt, they're not going to beat me. Well, that's where the quote comes in, and it says, well, that's where you get beat. Instead of going, hey, I believe that white belt can beat me, I'm going to be on the top of my game because I don't want to lose. Instead of saying, oh, he can't beat me, I'm good. And then you get beat because why? You underestimate your opponent. So it's like, it's this thing where it says don't underestimate somebody. And that's the kind of cleaner half of the quote, is don't underestimate somebody. That's just a short version, other than, that's the fancier way of saying, hey, believe that you can always be beat, but that's one thing where, you look at it and you say, don't underestimate somebody. At the end of the day, you shouldn't be estimating an opponent to begin with at all. You should be saying, hey, doesn't matter what rank they are, doesn't matter what they are. It just matters. What would matter? What is their most shot takedown? What takedown succeeds the most for them? Are they a super duck guy? Are they gonna do a Superman punch if it's UFC? Are they gonna go for doubles? Are they an armbar guy? You talk about those things in boxing. You say, okay, how many right hooks come out with the power? What is their movement? Do they like to cut off the ring? You have to understand some of those things, because that's a key. That's almost keys to success here. It's not, hey, oh, I beat him before. I beat him last year. Yeah, if you beat somebody last year, that doesn't mean they can't get better. I've seen guys that I beat all recreation, all rec, pop, 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 go to college and succeed. So you look at, that, and you say, okay, well, some could say, hey, didn't you go to college? Yes, I did. But, I mean, as far as they were making Atlantic City and places where they made states, which I never really made, but they put themselves in the right place. Because why? They said, hey, just because he beat me in rec doesn't mean he can beat me now. You get better. So, a lot of that is just about, no, don't underestimate your opponent. Always believe that they're capable of the uncapable. And that just goes in. You say, okay, he would have to get 7 shots off to get up ahead of me. It's not possible. I got great defense. He's never going to do that. Instead, say, okay, what are his first 7 shots going to be? Because I got to stop those and counter him with some good reattacks. So I now score. What, instead of saying he can't do something, believe that he can and say, okay, how can I change that? How can I change what I can do? That's one of the best ways I feel to work at it, is say, they can do the unthinkable. Now let's prevent the unthinkable. That's just something that, that just comes to mind when I talk about this. And, when you look at, the way most athletes will think about things, they don't go into something saying, I can or will be beat. They go into a lot of that stuff like, hey, I don't think you have a chance. And that's, going in and saying somebody doesn't have a chance is just not, it's not the right way to think. It's not a healthy way to think. It's in no way, shape, or form is it a way to think at all. It's just not, it's not something, it's not a way people should think. It's not even close. The aptitude of what goes on shouldn't cross each other. And that's just kind of why that quote stuck with me. Every time I looked at somebody, I believed that they could do the uncapable, and I prevented it. I prevented it for reasons being because, I believed they could do it. And I didn't want them to do it. I didn't want them to stop me. I didn't want them to take, I didn't want to get beat. There were times I didn't want to get beat, but, you get beat. You get humbled, when you mess around, when you don't, you have the chance to do certain things and you don't do it. You kind of mess around. You're kind of just, you're in a sense, you're playing with your food. And I can't tell you how many times I lost because of that, playing with the food. You can't play with the food. You just can't. And I can tell you countless times of losing because I thought I could, because I thought I was the guy, because I thought, oh, I can play with my food. That's no differently than anything. And that's what made a huge difference for me, because I thought I could. I thought I could do certain things like, oh, I thought I could turn a guy 3 times and say, oh, I'll turn him a couple more times. I'm gonna keep turning him. I'm gonna break the guy. And then I get a reversal, and now I'm on my back. It's just times I say, if you can get the 6, get the 6. Don't play with your food. And I would say those cost me losses a lot of times because I did that. Well, did I learn my lesson? Sure, I learned it the hard way. Don't play with the food. I learned that real easy. Don't play with the food. And that really fueled me to understand not to do the things I did before. Because when you do those things, you mess yourself up. You mess yourself up. Nobody wants to. Nobody wants to do things like that. Nobody wants to lose, but when you make mistakes, you get beat. You get real beat. You get real beat when you make mistakes. So, that's just, how I feel is you can't make those mistakes. You can't make those things that cause the mistakes to make them. You can't. You just can't. And you can't. And that's why I had the losses I did because, first of all, I played with my food a little too much, too many times, more than most than I was supposed to. And uh that caused a lot of problems for me, just in general. The recommendation is don't do it. Don't do it. It's not worth it. It's not something that should ever be worth it. And for me, it just isn't. It's just that one thing where you say you got to figure it out, and it's just that thing where it's like, hey, you don't want to get into that area of loss, that area where you say, okay, now I've lost, and it's kind of just one of those things where it's like, all right. So when you look at that and you translate that in terms of, hey, we gotta get into the events transpiring and what may need to go on and what must go on and all of that. When we talk about all of that must transpire, now we talk about something where we're in, a great area of this must happen, that must happen. A lot of what must happen comes to light because you look at what needs to go, what needs to be done, and you say, like, there's just so much there in terms of just, when I look at some of the UFC fighters, some of them, like Aaron Blanchfield that has I'll pull it up right now for you guys. Let's pull it up. 13-2. I look at that and I say, okay, let's make that 20-2. Let's, you know, let's build, learn, the biggest thing is learning from the losses, learning why. Most people say you can't change the routine, and that's true. You can't. You cannot change the routine. And that's just one of the biggest things that if you have a routine in the way you do something, you can't change it. It's just you can't. That's one of the greatest. That's one of the biggest pieces. You just can't. That's one of the greatest things to say to somebody is you can't. You have a good routine. You have a training. You have a routine. You do and you don't do. You want to kind of keep that as best you can. In the best ways you can because it gets different. It gets to those points where you say, okay, how can we build from what we're doing? What's the biggest thing we can do? And I think in terms of just all, in terms of everything, it's just you got to build off of the mistakes and things that are made. You got to build off of some of the greatest things that can happen and can't. It's not any one way where something happens. It's just building the building blocks and saying, hey, I got to build from this. I gotta do better than what I've done before. I gotta be better. Be more of an individual that can survive off of what I did. And that's just one thing where that I was able to learn, and just in general that I'm able to see, through all these sports. We're at episode 50. you know I've been in this game for about 50 straight well, not 50 straight episodes, but for a lot of 50 episodes here where now I understand, this and that. I understand this happening and that happening. I understand this and that. And and for that and for good reasons. For good reasons. I understand that stuff because I've been, out and around the sports and you start to obviously you don't learn all the analytics overnight. You don't learn all the analytics overnight, but you tend to pick up on things and get into the hows and whats. You start to be able to comfortably understand who you think is going to win, who you start to learn the different styles. It takes you time to get into all the sheer fold of athletes, but you know, you pick your top stars and you kind of just get that going, and it's a building foundation of blocks. That's just one thing I've been able to learn. All the things I've been able to do. Um, Even as much as I was able to learn from, going to an event like Men of War. We got to attend Men of War, and we got to be there Matt side, and to be able to be there Matt side and just look and learn, and you know if that's something you guys really like, we'll try to schedule a lot more of that, and we'll try to see, what's the best we can do on that. Men of War, that was a great event, and that's stuff that the weigh-in can get back to start doing some of those events again and getting ourselves in that because you know absolutely amazing being at Men of War. We were at several boxing events, um, great boxing events. We were there to see our boy JP, get his stuff done. We've gone to an event to see Danny before, with Rising Star Promotions. So, it's just, to be able to be at some of those stuff, like it's a learning curve. We've learned a lot, and through this process, we've learned so much. To be up to 50 episodes is a huge thing to like stick in it that long. And I'm pretty sure when we were, because many of you don't know, Sebastian has brought his channel back. He brought it back. But back in when we were in high school, man, we were daily vlogging. Like we were actually walking from school. If we went to different restaurants and places, we were vlogging it. We were daily vlogging. So that kind of did take a huge effect on us. We were able to do some of that stuff, and even then, like to be able to do some of that stuff is really, really nice. So, we've been in the, I think I don't remember how many episodes straight, but I had to be something over 50, 60. Editing to getting them done, really you know, the appetit of us. We were really getting into a lot of that. And I think, if you want a more breakdown of that on the how happenings and when we started our first, YouTube channels and whatnot, that could be surely a separate video. But no, I did get a lot out as much as I could, and that also helped my editing skills because now I do all the editing for the weigh-in and getting all that together and getting all the social media over to be posted and because that's it's a good thing, between the two partners we get stuff done. I mean, obviously when one takes extended periods of time away, the other one does some stuff, but that's not true. There's still some stuff that gets done. So, to be up to episodes 50, to just be, here, very thankful. 50 episodes. We've been able to get 50 big ones. If we have a next 50 episode goal, our goal here is to get more guests on here, all the way up to episode 100. And, 100's the big boy, and we're going to try to make sure the big one. And we're going to try to make sure we can get that, as good as it can be, get episode 100 as good as we can get it for you guys, because, that is we do this for you guys. We do this for, the fans of the weigh-in, which I understand. It's not many of you, but we see it. We see it, our average views we get a video, we see it. So really great thing and proud of that. And on this week's weigh-in, this is another one. So with that being said, this is another one, like, comment, subscribe as always. And this is the weigh-in by Benoit Chestnut and normally Sebastian Romero, but we will return to our regularly scheduled program at some point. Weigh-in out.
The way in where stories ignite.